So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for all of you. My name is Hernando Buitrago. I'm head of marketing at Privado, and I'm here with Nishant Bhajaria. He's a leading expert in the field of data privacy, technical privacy. He's author of the book Data Privacy, a Runbook for Engineers, and he's built technical programs at several organizations, including Meta, Uber, Google, Netflix as well. And we're also here with Engin Bozdag, who is PhD in AI ethics and senior staff privacy architect at Uber. And before we get going, let me just tell you one sentence about Privado. If you're not familiar, Privado syncs privacy compliance with software development by providing full data visibility and continuous privacy governance. So if you want to learn more, do reach out to our team. Happy to chat, share more information, answer any questions you may have. But we can now get to the topic of this conversation. And we're here to discuss with a couple of experts on how privacy and security adapt for a world of generative AI, and they'll give us their technical perspective on this. Anything you want to say before we start, Nishant, Engin?
I think we're good to go.
Okay, great. Well, let's start with, we see a lot of conversation on LinkedIn, especially about GenAI and the change and everything that's coming. What's your take on this? Is this a lot of hype, or do you feel like this is real? There's good introduction of GenAI into businesses delivering value. Curious to get your thoughts on that to start.
Engin, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of questions on whether this is another hype that we see. Is it similar to the whole .com era? And I mean, I think there are some parallels. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of excitement. So unrealistic expectations and over promises could potentially lead to hype. But there is also differences here, right, compared to previous hypes. One, I think with even though this technology is expensive, like if you look at OpenAI, they had an annualized run rate of $2 billion, and they need tens of billions more to keep going. And we do not yet see the application that kind of transforms everything. So the uptake is still pending. But generative AI, I think, is built upon established technologies, right? Like there's a decades of AI research. So the generative component is new, but like machine learning, natural language processing have been there for a while. And we already see proven use cases. I just read today on the newspaper that, you know, doctors, lawyers, they're already adapting it into their existing workflows, and they already see some improvements. And it also has a broader ecosystem. So, you know, it doesn't only affect one line of business, not just the tech sector. It has a potential to kind of disrupt broader in the industry. So I think there is a hype aspect, but the potential is also there. I don't know. What do you think, Nishant?
Yeah, Engin makes a great point. So the big difference between now and the .com bubble is, in the .com bubble in the late 1990s, the internet itself was fairly new. Like it did not have the widespread adoption that it has now. That was number one. The second thing is, Engin is completely right that the adoption has not taken over. Like we don't have an end-to-end soup to nuts use case yet. So my concern with GenAI is when people don't know what's happening and when they're in this age of cost cutting, that is when corners are cut. So my concern is, as these companies struggle to find out, okay, how do we monetize this thing? How do we adopt it wisely across the company? They will cut corners around data quality, around security, around privacy, and try to get the GenAI outcome to the market as quickly as possible to answer exactly the question Engin is raising, which is how do we prove that this thing actually works, right? So that is why the need for AI controls, AI governance, discipline, quality is important, because if we imbibe AI in large quantities right now, and then we struggle to find monetization by this time next year, we will also discover that all these corners that were cut from a data perspective are coming home to roost. So I think AI has amazing potential. I've talked to doctors' offices that are using it. And, you know, when you go to a doctor's office, for example, they first weigh you, they take your blood pressure, they talk to you about symptoms. I'm concerned that those jobs will be the first ones to go. When you go to the grocery store, the checkout counter is already automated. So the idea of having somebody help you on the floor if you can't find something, my concern is two things will happen if we don't address this quickly. The first is the poorest people among us will be the first ones to lose their job. That is an economic issue, not a privacy issue, security issue, but that is still a society issue. But the other thing is the personalization that will take place will occur without the right controls. And we discovered a lot of breaches in 2013, 2014. That was 3 or 5 years after cloud computing and global ID had taken over. So my concern is we might be making mistakes right now with GenAI that will not come to roost until the next 2 or 3 years. So I think that's why this forum, this session is important, because we want entrepreneurs and innovators to get ideas from us on how to build those controls in place rather than waiting for a law to come up or rather than waiting for a breach or something of that nature to happen.
Yeah, thanks both. Yeah, that leads into the next question that we have for you, and it's around to your point, and this is relevant to multiple lines of businesses. We're seeing in multiple industries for different people already adapting some form of AI into their workflows in business. So with AI regulation on the horizon, how do organizations prepare? What should they expect? How can they best prepare? What kind of controls? To your point, Nishant, should they be thinking about? Engin, you want to take that first?
Please.
Nishant, go ahead first.
Okay. I think my only concern, and it's a big one, is that it took a long time for the policy establishment to include the operations people and the engineers and the architects, people like me and Engin, into the conversation around security and privacy. For the longest time, and Engin and I worked together for a long time, we still sometimes hear privacy is a legal thing. Like people get surprised when the people who work in privacy are engineers. The phrase privacy engineering means different things depending on which company you're talking about. So I think when it comes to the right controls, you got to ask some basic questions. That is, are we protecting the infrastructure and the data to avoid usurpation of data? Are we trying to avoid bias, hallucinations? Like what controls exist? What monitoring exists? Like as an example, you may want to muck up your security data because you want to catch the bad guys before they do damage. So you want to think like them. So it makes sense to give people access within the company to corrupt your security data, right? Because then you can try things like spear phishing, training, and whatnot. But when it comes to GenAI, the scope is large, the data is large. So how do you break the data into small pieces and test in multiple locations? So I think this is going to have to require sort of a ballet dance between the policy people on the one side to achieve a larger policy goal and the engineering folks to make sure that they create the right controls to get the right signals and avoid slowing the company down unnecessarily. Because my other worry is if people on the security and privacy side come in with all their controls and that slows the engineers down, what will happen is the engineers will make duplicate copies of the data and do the GenAI stuff anyways. And that will mean that the privacy, security, and GenAI will become code for you guys are slowing us down without any security or privacy benefit to the end user. So we have to avoid under checking and over processing at the same time. But I would love to hear Engin's thoughts.
Yeah, I think when I talk to privacy engineering leaders or people who are running security or privacy on the technical side, they're not very well informed yet on for example, the upcoming legal development. Some things the EU AI Act already is in effect, which it's not, or they don't know that GDPR or other privacy laws already cover a good bunch of AI related risk. On the other end of spectrum, when I talk to lawyers, the focus is on these data processing agreements, the EU AI Act itself, or the whole explainability, but they talk more on the very high level concepts, like we need fairness, we need explainability, but nobody discusses how do we achieve it, which tools are available, and is it actually feasible, and what do we need from the industry. So I think I really like this hourglass model of organizational AI governance. It's a research paper. It basically builds AI governance into 3 ladders. The first ladder is what are the external factors? So the first component on external factors for your organization, obviously this EU AI Act or Singapore Model AI governance framework, or there's a bunch of these regulations, but also industry best practices like OWASP has a security framework, or the NIST has a management framework, or even things like academic concept like a value sensitive design. What do your users want? Yes, these are the regulations, but what are the users' needs? People are getting more aware about these technologies and are hesitant to use sometimes due to privacy and security risks. So these external factors you should take in, and also think about organizational factors, like what does your organization want to do with AI? What are the resources? What do you want to use it on? What are your organizational values? And which products actually will use generative AI? and then finally turn it into more operational parts, something Nishant mentioned, like technical capabilities. What kind of encryption do you want? And how do you manage risk? Who owns what? And finally turn it into this part. So I'm seeing the legal and the technical are not yet talking to each other. One is really looking into the technical, the existing security risks, and the other is looking into more the contracts, the future regulations. We need to have a bit more conversation. That's what I'm saying.
And I'll just make a point real quick. I think we've talked a lot about tooling before, right? So I think sometimes when it comes to privacy and security, the focus becomes on something very specific. So in the case of security, it's infrastructure. People want to protect the keys, the actual infra, the perimeter, the firewall. When it comes to privacy, people often think about data, but I think in this case, we can do both, but there is a special need for code and data. So as an example, you might have engineers across the company or even designers, machine learners, AI specialists using GenAI from a code perspective. The data hasn't appeared yet, because they're trying to write the code to collect the data to begin with. So if you had a code scanning solution, you could say, okay, this service one day, someday will become a GenAI service. So you can essentially coach those people right away. If you wait for those people to write their code, get the data, feed it to the model, it's a little bit too late, because given the scale of GenAI, you cannot always reverse engineer back as to where the saga began. So if you have a code scanning solution as an example of the controls, you can identify, you can have an engineer swear up and down and say, I'm not doing anything with data. I'm not using GenAI. We've had that before, right? And then it turns out they're calling a service that's calling another service that's calling a GenAI model down the road, right? So how do you use something like code scanning to detect? This is not to blame anybody. It's to avoid a situation where people's incomplete knowledge becomes a PR and a legal issue. That's number one. The second thing is, when you have actual data that is being fed into these models, you can use tools like k-anonymity to identify, for example, the identification risk. You're claiming that the data size is large enough and the model secure enough to avoid bias, as an example, right? But for example, in some cohorts, in some zip codes, the size of the data is so small that identification risks are pretty high. What that means is the model is being trained against a very specific use case, which will then apply more broadly, which could open allegations of bias or other harms, right? So I think the opportunity here is we have tools, we have techniques available based on our knowledge of security and privacy mistakes of times past. The goal is going to be, how do we repurpose them quickly to adapt them to this world where the size of data and the impact of models is going to be way, way bigger than anything we've seen before.
Great, thank you. And I do want to encourage folks who are listening in to ask any questions. Go ahead. We can tackle them along the way or at the end. Either way, just feel free to, if you hear anything that you're curious about, we can expand on that. And you're already touching on some of the risks for privacy and security. Is there anything else you want to add around risks that this GenAI boom or applications are bringing to businesses?
Yeah, I think we're talking about hallucinations and bias and fairness, right? But I think first thing, as an organization, you should ask is, how secure is your vendor that you use an LLM? Maybe they tell they have an enterprise edition, or they have this ISO 27001 certification. But like, if you need to dig in a bit more, you might say that's the security team's job as a privacy professional, but maybe security team is not up to date. So questions are, are they really encrypting it up to standards? Are they rotating their keys? Is this all best practices? We noticed that's not always the case. We've seen where users' prompts leaked to other companies. So in memory errors, for example, were there to blame. So kind of have your due diligence rather than just the checklist, because it's potentially sensitive data that might be being used upon. Second part is, I think that's not often thought about on security is, there was this research that showed that people trusted the code generated by AI, generative AI, too much. These computer scientists or software engineers, they thought, it should be good because AI makes it, right? And then turns out half of it had security vulnerabilities. This kind of applies to anything generated by the AI. Kind of have your due diligence, sanitization on your output, the whole sandbox testing and all these things that should apply here. And finally, on the security risk side, prompt injections. So these are type of attacks where, people can have these malicious queries and try to extract personal data, or kind of reveal the policy you have implemented in your chatbot, for example. So once you make your AI available to the public, you need to think about, what do I put in there? Like, should I treat it maybe as a public information? Maybe not put sensitive data there in the first place. So what we see on the security front, existing threats apply, such as data governance, insecure output handling, but also new threats in much more amplified way become apparent. Anything to add here on security, Nishant?
Yeah, I would say if you look back at the breaches that took place that were pretty prominent for our time, the Target, and I use this example often, the Target breach from almost a decade ago and the Colonial Pipeline breach from like 3 or 4 years ago. In both cases, you had access to data maintained by third-party vendors or somebody who didn't really care enough about security. So you had credentials that were like in the ether on the dark web, some log someplace, and there was no actual key management. So you have a situation where there is proper encryption of the data, but nobody owns the credentials in the actual data and nobody manages the keys properly. So all it takes for a bad actor is to come into the system, identify the logs, identify the keys, and then all you have is no time to waste, because at that point they can get all control of Active Directory and they can access everything. They can have a full takeover. And then at that point, they can use it for prompt injection, corrupting the data. They can use it for manipulation, right? So at the end of the day, what I want to avoid is for people to think that GenAI is so new and so different that a whole new set of tools is required. I think our existing set of tools can get us started in a good place to understand the risk. Like when you go and see your doctor for the annual physical, they don't immediately give you 10 new medications, right? They check your EKG, they check your pulse, they check your pressure. They may send you for a follow-up test with a specialist, and then they come up with an assessment regime to decide what needs to happen for you to be in good health. So I think we are at the ECG stage right now, and we have the tools available. So my ask to people who listen to this webinar would be, take your existing tools and see how you can apply them to protect data in a more meaningful fashion for GenAI. Because what happens is, at this point, if you go to your management team and say, GenAI is here, we're going to build all these things from scratch, you probably won't get much support, because people are going to be like, oh, but this is a brand new tool, we're just starting it, nobody else is doing it. There'll be 50 excuses to not invest in GenAI security from scratch. What you can, however, do is use existing tools and repurpose them. And if you do that, you can essentially get in the good graces of your bosses by saying, hey, look, we are using these tools for a use case that we didn't intend to. So let's add to the existing tools. And politically speaking, what that means is the engineers who build those tools will be happy. The legal attorneys who depend upon those tools will be happy. And you will learn more things about the GenAI use in your office case, right? Because what happens is you may not be fully aware of how your teams are using GenAI. Even they may not be aware either. So by using existing tools and solutions and repurposing them, you will learn what the gaps are. And that gap will give you a much better understanding of what the risks are, what the opportunities are, without spending a whole lot of money. Because the worry I have right now is companies are going to either give up or just essentially assume that nothing bad is going to happen. And we see how that turns out.
Yeah. Great. So before we get deeper into tools and methods, in terms of the risk, yeah, heightened emphasis on best practices for privacy and security, of course, but then there's the new threats. And so curious on your take on technical implications of these new threats. Like, how do you address those? Or how should you be thinking about those? Nishant, do you want to start that?
Yeah, I think the key thing is going to be, how do you identify the before and the after? I'd love to hear Engin's thoughts on this one. So as an example, when it comes to prompt injection, how do you check and make sure something is anomalous? So during my time at Netflix, we often got hit with cyber attacks, DDoS attacks, etc., from people who didn't like our content, as an example. So one use case that comes to mind is, how do you identify usage that is different? How do you see a prompt behaving totally differently? How do you monitor quickly? So this is going to be a combination of having an active list of things that you can essentially consider to be correct and normal, and compare them to actual activity. So as an example, to use the doctor's example from before, if my blood pressure is typically 120 on 80, and on that day suddenly it's like 150 or 95, the doctor may ask me, am I eating more salt? Am I having more fried food, etc.? So working backwards from the difference between observed behavior and expected behavior is the way to go. The key I will again mention is the scale is really vast. So use existing tools as much as possible in the beginning. Go after use cases that you know, and you can decide the difference between actual and observed, and start from there. So I think that's how I would start it. But Engin, what are your thoughts, Engin?
Yeah, so the existing tools, for example, what Nishant mentioned on data governance, like how do you rotate your keys? So even if the key leaks, the damage is limited. So these are important. On the novel tools, so these are really made for LLMs. There are tools that are so-called AI guards. What they do is they filter out potentially malicious input before it even reaches the LLM. They even use LLMs to analyze an incoming data and see if it's threatening, or also the output data. Will the LLM have toxicity and potentially give some output that could lead to controversy? But they're more at the infancy, and it's also challenging, right? Like, for example, if there is a data that reveals a user's sexual orientation, just alone that specific sentence doesn't mean you know who the person is. You need to take a look at the whole context and see if the user is re-identifiable. And those tools don't do very well there. They kind of look at every sentence, try to match a particular word and whether it's PII or whether it's toxic, etc. So take it with a grain of salt and use them, but also don't think they will catch each and everything. So you need to have some backup options. And that's where I typically say the good old principle, data minimization, always is a good idea. Always, when you talk to your data scientists, machine learning engineers, they'll start with, I want to send each and every data to the LLM, and hopefully that helps. You should question, show me the data where it actually helps that I send users sensitive information and the model is more accurate. Like, is that the case? Typically, that's not the case, right? The less data you have, the less problems you have, then you also maybe need to worry about deletion a bit less, and maybe bring some of the cost aspect also in the discussion, because deleting data from a model is a very costly thing. Just deleting from existing training data is not sufficient. You need to make the model unlearn, and that's or retrain, and these are really expensive processes. So use the standard approaches, but also maybe experiment and try out some of the novel approaches. We need to find a balance.
And as an example, I want to steal one of Engin's examples. We've talked about this a while ago. So the key is going to be, how do you analyze input prompts for any patterns that makes no sense when it comes to data extraction? So as an example, what I'm protecting here from is any bad actor on the outside taking advantage of loose security, or any internal actor on an engineering side or the DS side that is being a little careless. So as an example, one thing we deal with is a lot of engineers don't have English as their first language. Engineering is a very global skill right now, especially GenAI as well. So if you have a comment that says extract this data or combine this data set, it could mean a legitimate use of that data, or it could mean that somebody is about to do something pretty stupid. As an example, if you were to assign me a specific drug based on symptoms that I've entered online, it makes sense if the only people looking at that data are going to be my PCP or my specialist, my heart specialist. On the other hand, though, if that data is being extracted by a pharma company to pitch drugs, you may not want to combine my name with somebody else's name. So that's going to be an example here would be, you can use a scanning solution to scan through the code to detect where the data is going to get spat out, or what comments somebody's entered, along with anonymity to identify the data set, along with phrases to see exactly what phrases people have used in the past to make mistakes. So engineers often copy code from each other, right? So one bad phrase can also get copied to the rest of the code. So the example here is, how do you use a combination of tools? One mistake people make is when I often hear from them is, what one thing can we do to address all these risks? And people are assuming that there's going to be one major tool that will land, that will help them. It's going to be a combination of internal controls, scanning solutions, monitoring solutions, alerting solutions, log reviews. And I think the cool thing is, security already does some of this. And when it comes to data, the machine learning folks, the data scientists have been doing this for a long time. The key is going to be, for people on this webinar who are listening, who are privacy security experts, the opportunity for them is to bring together these people in one room, identify the key data sets, the key harms that they're concerned about, and apply these controls in the background, and then meet again to discover what tooling has to happen. I think I'll emphasize again and again, small victories are better than big defeats. So try and find those small victories early on, build those bridges, use those tools, and let the evidence do the talking. Back to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Yeah, it sounds like you're discussing some of the tools and methods that folks need to be thinking about in order to get their house in order and govern for AI. There was a live question. I think Engin, you answered that. Did you want to cover that live? So there was a question on what
Yeah,
AI safety.
the question is, how can AI safety help with jailbreak prompts? So people trying to extract information from your model or your chatbot or system. I gave some examples of like Rebuff or Meta's Llama guards are examples where they use various methods, whether an LLM itself or heuristics, to identify this suspicious or potentially harmful content in the input and output. So this could be personal data leakage, but it could also be some content that promotes violence or hate speech and anything more toxic. So they kind of sit between the LLM and the user and your organization. So kind of does the sanitization and filtering. So that would be one way to work with the jailbreak prompts. You could also enhance your prompts to not respond to specific attempts on top of these tools. But in the end, best practice would be once it's user facing, again, minimize what is going to the LLM and what the LLM can do in the backend. I know some companies connect their LLM into internal systems, so once the attacker gains access, they could now go further than the LLM. So kind of putting these boundaries would also there help. Hopefully that answers the attendee's question.
Great, thank you for that, Engin. So, and going back to what's top of mind for, I expect most of everybody who's listening in, they're thinking about setting up AI governance within their organization. And we've touched a little bit on this, but what would you say should folks be thinking is the foundational principles for implementing AI governance?
I'll take a stab in a line. Again, I think there is going to have to be some need when it comes to governance. The challenge for the word governance is people don't always know what it means. It's like the word artisan. It's like the word organic. People sound very smart when they say it. And when you go to LinkedIn these days, everything is like a noun and a verb and GenAI. And my worry is everybody's in on the action. So everybody's doing something or the other. So we need some level of centralization. I think when it comes to how we live our life, some things have to be true. Like if you tell me it's 8 o'clock in the morning and say, no, it's 8 p.m. in the evening instead, and my watch says different, one of us is lying. Either my watch is dead or you're lying. I think we have to have some level of centralization. So how do we make sure that there is a central LLM control governance? So how do we make sure this is the principle of data minimization? So what does that actually mean? Does it mean we throttle ingest APIs? Does it mean we check API logs more often? Does it mean we scan the calls more often? So I think having some level of central, observable, acceptable behaviors and having controls to enforce those behaviors and having remediation be made at the engineering and legal level at the same time is pretty critical. Because I think what happens is when it comes to these toolings, when it comes to the outcomes, somebody has to make decisions. And it's going to be very rare to find one person who's willing to say, stop this or start this, because ultimately they will own the risk. So having some combination of the legal team, the engineering team, the DS team, the product team, making that decision jointly will be pretty critical, because otherwise what will happen is you will have either some level of bottom-up revolution where every engineer is going to think that what they're doing is governance, or there's going to have to be some chaos type situation to happen when all these leaders get together. So my recommendation would be for AI governance, you need to make sure that the leaders in the company, at least on the 4 vectors, product, engineering, data science, and legal, come together. You would not buy a house without having an inspection, without having a realtor, without having seen the room. So you need multiple input points before you buy a house, right? Why on earth would you shop the LLM model across the company without having some controls in place? And those controls, human controls, need to be in place before people start using GenAI. Because otherwise what will happen is these folks will come together in a room, but not to build a nice building, but to stop the building from burning down. So my first principle would be these leaders need to be aware of the details. Like very rarely do these people get level involved in the details these days. The assumption is the leaders provide high level guidance. My pushback to that is the leaders need to understand the possible consequences of making the wrong decisions and the business opportunity of making the right investments in the beginning. So as long as they're willing to make that investment in time, the decision is based on something solid, and the ability to go back and forth with the teams using GenAI, that's critical for AI governance. Because my hope is we don't wait for a federal law. Like I don't think there is a federal law that tells me not to drink 10 beers a day. There may be, but I don't think there is one. I don't do it because I know it's a stupid thing to do. So I think having some level of top-down buy-in is pretty critical. I'm not saying top-down fiat. I'm not saying top-down mandate necessarily. I'm saying top-down buy-in and having that collaboration happen rather than make the mistake we did for the last 10 years where everything was bottom-up and we are paying the price when it comes to bad data quality to this day. Engin?
Engin, how about you?
So I think Nishant said, you need to buy in. So essentially, the organization's strategy has and risk appetite is gonna inform the whole process. But I think the key gap I see when I talk to different privacy engineers, privacy lawyers, is accountability is not always well defined within organizations. Is it even within legal? Like, are we talking to privacy legal, cybersecurity legal, or maybe some other form of legal that is the single-threaded owner here that takes the AI governance? It's sometimes not clear. You have to talk to multiple stakeholders, and the decision maker is not always clear. So that's one, like clear governance structures, roles and responsibilities, policies, owners, escalation paths, or who's going to audit, is someone's going to approve before something goes to deployment. This all needs to be very specific. Second is, the model governance itself, like which models in your organization are subject to the regulations. Like if you look at EU AI Act, not all systems are actually under scope. Some are deemed as low risk. They have other duties, requirements compared to high risk, and some you can't even launch because they're prohibited. So kind of have this model inventory internally and kind of categorize which side of the legislation, which ones apply, which ones need a human in the loop to review an output. What is your fairness metric threshold? So these technical policies also need to be in place, which is often missing. And the operation side, who's going to test this for AI governance? Privacy will need to be involved, security will need to be involved, but also beyond, right? Like there's the whole fairness part. Who's going to be reviewing? Who's going to build the tools? Or are you going to buy the tools or deploy an open source solution? And finally, who's covering data governance and all that. So these first start with that, like, because if you look at most legislations, I think the Singapore model AI governance framework is a good one. It lists these requirements, the accountability, the operations management. So kind of go from there and define those roles, or maybe start those discussions before buying tools, or before, as Nishant mentioned before, either give up on generative AI or embrace it without control. These are both extremes. Kind of understand your organization's goals and the risk better, and then have a plan to go further.
Yeah, so to summarize that a little bit, sorry, go ahead, Nishant.
I was going to say, just a very simple example, right? People often assume that once a model runs, the data is here and we can use it. The problem is that data becomes input for another. So the output from one model could become input for another model or another system. And I think as the size of the code grows, as the size of the data grows, the risks also grow. Data combination and risk combination and code combination is not something you can prepare for in advance. So as an example, you can say, when you have these libraries now becoming the combination of existing code and data with the output of this central LLM model, are we now more vulnerable to SQL injection or cross-site scripting, right? Because those sorts of things become apparent over time. And people often ask me, is GenAI, are these models sentient? And there's no way for us to prove that right now. But what they are is they have growth in scale and they have context that changes the actual output possible. So do new risks become viable? So having those checks is pretty critical. So one way the governance program would work is you have these 4 people sitting at the apex. It's going to be their responsibility to bring people along with them. So as an example, the eng leader in the council has the responsibility of bringing security to the table and making sure that these scans security teams run. these alerts they send become applicable to not just existing data or vendors, but new vendors, new code, new models, and the output of one model, even though it is not being egressed from the company, and have those kinds of ideas. You want to increase the blast radius and the coverage level of tools gradually and continuously. So if you draw a graph, when I was at Netflix, there was this graph inside it. I think it's still there in Building E, if I remember correctly. Reed Hastings drew a graph that says, here is the cost of sending a DVD halfway across the country. And that graph kept going up from left to right. And here is the cost of sending the same movie on the internet. And that graph kept going down. And at some point, it was cheaper to stream the movie from the internet than to send it in a red DVD. So you have to ask yourself, at what point is the cost of having this size of data grow exceed the benefit that comes from it? So having these tools means you're repurposing, using existing security tools, lowering the cost of the security team because now more people are using their tools, and you're lowering the risk that comes with it. So at some point, the lines will cross. So you want the data-driven mentality that runs your business to run your AI governance control model as well. And by doing that, you are making it less about process. What I want to avoid is unnecessary bureaucracy and process. I think anybody on this call who thinks that the DPI and the PI have been a success probably needs to step outside and smell the sun a little, because I want to have whatever they're having. It must be pretty numbing to the brain, because I think the DPI made people feel good about the work that was done, but it put unnecessary risks on the shoulder of the legal teams that were not qualified or prepared to take it. So what I'm saying is, let's increase the coverage of existing tools. Let's make fewer assumptions, and let's do it early in the game so that when it's time to really use these large models at a larger scale, you have much more confidence that those controls are going to apply. Also, if as a business you want to raise more money, you want to go into a new market, you can prove to your regulators, hey, look, we have these controls. We are investing not just in GenAI, but in controls as well, even though they're using current security control. So it's a great win to have from a business perspective while getting the most of your GenAI investments without stepping into dog poop along the way along.
Yeah, it's interesting you both have brought up how the more data, more problems you have, right? The risk is higher, the costs will be higher. And so this is in contrast to the last 10 years where the rise of data and data lakes and harvesting data, the more data, basically talking about data as oil or gold for companies, which is true. But at the same time, especially with the rise of LLMs now and AI applications, this becomes a huge risk, and how important it is to understand how that data is flowing and where it's coming from. So good points on that. Opening up for more questions here from the audience, but curious to also hear from both of you on, after discussing these foundational principles for AI governance, what is available to folks in terms of methods, tools, and what gaps are there? You mentioned there's some tools there, but they're nascent tools on the AI governance side, but what should folks be thinking? What are the gaps that maybe they cannot cover today, things that have to be built, but what is available now?
You want to go for a second?
The more I'd say more on the mature side or more, ready for enterprise side is obviously kind of detect the data leakage. So you might have your policies, you might give the best advice, you give your PIAs and to your employees, but data might still leak. They might not be aware, or who knows, maybe it's sent by mistake. So things like obviously Privado, right, scan the code and detects the data is leaving your premises, or other DLP tools where that sensitive data shouldn't be there at the first place. These are some of the stuff on understanding the flow, detecting leakage. So that's one. As I mentioned, these AI guards are usable, not guaranteeing 100% identification or masking, but they are useful. There are adversarial training tools, so you could benchmark your system to see, how does it work with adversarial examples. So when you do some sort of a red teaming before launching your application, you can use them to identify potential issues, or even do like some sort of a black box bias testing, right? Like how does the LLM react to specific data sets and versus others? What if you change the name? What if you change specific attributes? Those exist. More promising, but we're not there yet, ones are reliable synthetic data generators. So for many purposes, you don't need personal data to test, right? I'm hearing many companies are exploring, like, does this thing even work for my use case? But they are using personal data or identifiable data, which brings a risk, whether it's a compliance risk or actual security privacy risk. An actual synthetic data generator that produces useful, realistic data would be very important. I don't think we have reliable ones yet for all domains. I know some exist in specific domains. And other things that I'm really looking forward to is machine learning tools. So these are at the infancy. Basically, instead of retraining your model with new data set, you can say, forget this particular user. Because retraining, as I said, has some effects, costs, but also once you remove a particular user's data, it can also affect performance, so or the accuracy of the model. So machine learning is something I'm really looking forward to, along with synthetic data generation. These are very mature, but the mature ones, as I said, code scanners, the DLPs, or things that act as guards or anonymizers on demand, like data maskers, are something that we can test today. Nishant?
Absolutely. So I remember, again, I keep citing my real experience here. But when I was pushing to use synthetic data at Netflix, this is before GenAI even became a phrase. The pushback we often got is our fake data is not as good as our production data. And the pushback I gave to that pushback is our creator data will be much better than our production data, because the prod data only speaks to existing use cases, right? So when you use synthetic data for testing purposes, you can use existing production data as a bit of a baseline, and then ask yourself what new use cases may exist. And then you have this continuous handoff where today's production data becomes tomorrow's synthetic data. And that synthetic data will give you a much better sense of what the day after tomorrow's prod data is going to be. So having that relationship is pretty critical. But the goal here is, don't just confine yourself to existing production data, because you are only testing for known use cases. And I would struggle to find any machine learner or any data scientist that will tell you that's sufficient, because you always test for the next thing. If people are using GenAI and machine learning to detect tomorrow's use cases and tomorrow's personalization needs, you cannot then tell me that the only testing ground available is prod data. The model fails right at the outset, right? So my goal would be to push for synthetic data, given that you have these LLM models creating new reality anyway. So use these models to create the data to test them, and use that data to make these models better. So I think what I want to avoid is people getting into this debate as to which data is better. The key is going to be, how do you come up with the richest data set that represents the most potent risks and the most potent possibilities of both what you know you have in production right now and the use cases that will come based on the thing you're testing for going forward.
And Nishant, anything else on existing tools or future coming tools beyond the synthetic data, production data conversation?
I think Engin said it all. I don't think I have much to add to that.
Excellent. Well, so we're getting to the end here, and open it up for you as well. Anything else you want to share on the topic, Engin and Nishant? You are the experts, so always, I'm sure the audience is happy to hear as much as possible from both of you.
I think this is going to be hard for people to do, practically speaking, but I would say open source your ideas and your questions, because today's use cases for you become tomorrow's use cases for somebody else. And I think one challenge in the security and privacy field is people are often leery of sharing information, because they're concerned that anytime you radiate something, you're essentially saying that, hey, this is a gap. And then your attorneys in the company will tell you to share as little as possible. So if we can find a way, culturally speaking, to build a community around GenAI, and we have a community in Privado that Fernando's going to send a link about, how do you ask questions in a safe place? For example, if people in this webinar have questions right now, you can use the anonymous feature and we will not know who you are. So I think it is critical for us to build a community that is not about this tool or that tool or this data set, to have a robust conversation and create that awareness. Because my concern at this point is, what will happen is the policy folks will debate, and it'll take a long time. I've been told since 2016 that a privacy law is coming. I didn't have as many gray hair as I do right now. So the next GenAI law will probably come in the years to come, at least a law that's impactful. So I would rather have a situation where today's known use cases and tomorrow's anticipated use cases can create provisions in that law. So I think having some sort of community open source would be very helpful. And I think that's going to be the key going forward. But I look forward to people asking us questions. We still have 15 minutes to go here.
And we'll share the link with the community and the follow-up email to this conversation, so you can join there. And in the coming months, we'll be having regular workshops and office hours with Nishant, so you can jump on calls directly with a small group, private group, and ask Nishant questions directly. So that will be available coming up. That's if you join the community. Engin, anything else from your end?
Two things to echo Nishant. I mean, we need a community that kind of informs each other with various disciplines. So interdisciplinary collaboration. I mean, sounds a bit cliche, but it is true. We have to break the silos. I often see the legal folks not understanding the technical limitations, like, you need to do fairness, or we need to delete everything. There's a technical challenge, right? And on the technical side, folks might not always be understanding the requirements and what the users expect, what the regulators are expecting. So definitely, there is value to hearing from different sides. And second thing that I want to add to emphasize, like, ensuring responsible AI is not a one-time task. It's not like you buy a tool or do your check review for your model one time and then you're done. It should be a continuous process. You need to keep monitoring. Like, imagine maybe use a particular version of an LLM, everything works, accuracy is great, but what if that model gets updated? There is a chance that things don't work anymore as they were before, or new risk vectors or attack surfaces might be in place. So see this as a continuous thing, not as a one-time off task.
Yeah, that's right. Makes sense. Excellent. So let's give a few seconds here in case folks have any questions, but it looks like we're good otherwise, and we're also up to the time that we allotted. So we'll give it a couple. Okay. Doesn't seem like there's any questions coming up right now, but yeah, thank you so much, Nishant, Engin. Really appreciate your insights, expert insights on this. Definitely highly relevant topic for everybody, and still obviously a lot of open questions in it. So it's an ongoing conversation that we'll be having. Thanks for joining. Thanks everybody for wherever you're joining. Hope you enjoy the conversation, and we'll see you soon.